On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was summoned to present herself before her husband's small council at Greenwich Palace. As she walked towards the room where the small group of men were gathered, she may have had some trepidation as to what lay ahead, for only the day before her husband, King Henry VIII, had ridden off from the May Day joust quite suddenly without wishing her a goodbye. But surely Anne could not have contemplated that this walk would be the start of her doom. Presenting herself, the Queen was told that she was arrested on charges of adultery and high treason, and was to accompany the men by barge along the River Thames to the Tower of London. Anne's downfall and those loyal to her was shockingly fast and carried out with staggeringly swift efficiency. Despite her shock, Anne agreed to join the men, not knowing that within 2 weeks she would be dead. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast subscriber episode, The Arrest of Queen Anne Boleyn. On the 1st of May 1536, the traditional May Day joust was held at Greenwich Palace. Until now, everything seemed relatively normal. The king had even signed a letter a couple of days before in which he mentioned his entirely beloved queen and that it was likely that God would send them a male heir soon. The king was, however, clearly feigning this, for around the same time he told an astonished ambassador Eustace Chapuis that he had been tricked into the marriage with Anne by the promises of witchcraft and that she would have a son. With this in mind, the king declared that he felt their marriage was invalid, leaving him free to marry should he desire. As queen, Anne Boleyn was a key part of the May Day celebrations and appeared richly adorned and bejewelled. At this time, she was, however, completely ignorant of the fact that her life was slowly unravelling around her. Her court musician, Mark Smeaton, had been arrested and potentially tortured to get evidence in support of Thomas Cromwell's plans to oust her as queen. Now, I feel it prudent to state that Thomas Cromwell would not have dared to move against Anne Boleyn unless the king had given him some indication that he was accepting of it. Indeed, Henry's demeanour shows him to be cheerfully indifferent to Anne's fate by this stage, which is greatly at odds with his later reaction to the news of Catherine Howard's affairs a few years later, when he broke down in tears and threatened to kill the young woman with his bare hands. The other 4 men who would also fall alongside Anne Boleyn may have played roles in the day's jousts. Certainly we know that Anne's brother, George, Lord Rochford, led the challengers, while Sir Henry Norris led the defenders. According to Lancelot de Carle, secretary to the French ambassador, William Brereton and Francis Weston also rode in the lists. King Henry was quietly given a piece of information which caused him to abruptly stand up and depart the celebrations, taking only 6 men with him, including Henry Norris. His sudden departure caused alarm, most acutely with Queen Anne. As she watched her husband walk away, she could not have possibly known that this was the last time that she would ever see him. Conversely, did the king consider that he too was walking away from the woman that he was once completely obsessed with? Although we cannot say for certain, it is generally accepted that the information that Henry was given was Mark Smeaton's confession and admission that Henry Norris had also shared the Queen's bed. On the way back to Westminster, the king questioned Norris at length, promising him a pardon if he spoke the truth, or to be more precise, spoke the specific truth that Henry wanted to hear, even if it was an outright lie. Not knowing what was happening, but surely suspicious that something certainly was happening, it is reasonable to conclude that Anne would have been very uneasy for the rest of the day. Her sole comfort is that her young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was very likely with her, for she was recorded as being at court around that time. On the morning of the 2nd of May 1536, Sir Henry Norris, having failed to give the king the answers he wanted, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Just hours later, Anne's beloved brother George was also arrested, although he was at Whitehall Palace, which may indicate that he was aware of what was happening and had attempted to reach the king to plead for his sister. On the morning of the 2nd, Anne rose early, ate some breakfast, before hearing mass in her closet, as was customary. Afterwards, she was groomed and dressed by her ladies, preparing to attend a tennis match where one of the athletes competing was personally sponsored by her. As she was watching the match, news came that Anne was to present herself to the King's Privy Council. She left the tennis match and presented herself in the council chamber in front of a royal commission, which, according to Charles Risley, comprised Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the Queen's uncle, William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, Thomas Audley, the Lord Chancellor, William Fitzwilliam, the Lord Treasurer, Sir William Paulet, Comptroller of the Household, and finally the architect of the whole affair, Thomas Cromwell. There she was informed that she was being accused of committing adultery with 3 different men, Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, and a third, unnamed at this stage. Anne would later recount that as these accusations were being read out, the absolute dick that was the Duke of Norfolk audibly tut-tut-tutted while shaking his head at his own niece. Anne was also told that Smeaton and Norris had confessed, although we know that this is not the case with Norris. Anne stoutly denied the accusations, but her words were in vain, and the Royal Commission ordered her arrest. Her composure changed when they produced the warrant which made it clear that her arrest was by order of the King and that Henry had signed the warrant himself. Anne kept a tight grip on her composure and said, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, then I am ready to obey." No doubt in a state of deep shock, Anne was then informed that they wouldn't be leaving straight away, but that she should return to her apartments until the tide of the Thames had turned more favourable. One man who could be counted on to react with undiluted pleasure at the fate now befalling Anne Boleyn was the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who, aside from only ever referring to Anne as the concubine, had also refused to acknowledge her as queen. He therefore reported to his master, the Emperor Charles V, that Anne was only given up to 4 women to join her en route to the Tower, and that the charges against her had been adultery with her chamber musician. Around 3 p.m, word was given that the tide had turned more favourable, and so the sombre group, with Anne at its centre, could begin their journey along river to the dreaded fortress of the Tower of London. Anne would have been highly visible to the London populace, and it's interesting to consider what was going through both Anne's head and the people watching on as their anointed queen made what would be a one-way journey to the fortress where only 3 years earlier she had lodged in preparation of her coronation. Upon arrival at the Tower, Anne Boleyn did not enter via the famous Traitor's Gate, but was instead conducted into the Tower via the Court Gate of the Byward Tower, which is just around the corner from the main entrance into the Tower that visitors today would go through. She climbed the steps up before falling to her knees and insisting on her innocence, telling the men before her to beseech the King's grace to be good unto me. This did nothing to change her plight, as the men looked on with cold indifference. She was met by Sir Edmund Walsingham, the lieutenant of the Tower, and then taken into the royal apartments, where she re-encountered the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, who had been with her at Greenwich following her arrest. Kingston kept up a steady stream of letters to Thomas Cromwell to keep him informed of Anne's behaviour and the things that she said during her time in the Tower. The day after Anne's arrival, Kingston sent a letter which tells us much about his and Anne's initial conversation. He had said that, "On my Lord of Norfolk and the King's Council departing from the Tower, I went before the Queen into her lodging. She said unto me, 'Mr. Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?' I said, 'No, madam, you shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation.' 'It is too good for me,' she said. 'Jesus have mercy on me.' And then she kneeled down, weeping a good pace, and in the same sorrow fell into a great laughing, as she has done many times since. She desired me to move the King's Highness, that she might have the sacrament in her closet by her chamber, that she might pray for mercy, for as I am clear from the company of men, as for sin as I am clear from you, and am the King's true wedded wife. And then she said, 'Mr. Kingston, do you know wherefore I am here?' And I said, 'Nay.' And then she asked me, when saw you the king? And I said, I saw him not since I saw him in the tilt-yard. And then, Mr. Kingston, I pray you to tell me where my lord my father is. And I told her I saw him afore dinner in the court. Oh, where is my sweet brother? I said I left him at York Place, and so I did. I hear say, said she, that I should be accused with 3 men. O Norris, hast thou accused me? Thou art in the Tower with me, and thou and I shall die together. And mark, thou art here too. O my mother, thou wilt die with sorrow. And then she said, Mr. Kingston, shall I die without justice? And I said, the poorest subject of the king hath justice. And therewith she laughed. It is clear from this report that Anne was undergoing the mother of all emotional roller coasters, which given her situation is unsurprising. Matters would be made worse for Anne when she was presented with the 4 women who would accompany her at all times. This group, more akin to spies than servants, were to report back everything that she said and did to Kingston, so that he could in turn inform Cromwell. The women were Mary Scrope, wife of Sir William Kingston, Margaret Dymock, who was married to William Coffin, Anne's master of the horse, a Mistress Stoner, and finally Anne's own aunt, Elizabeth Boleyn, not to be confused with her mother, who was also called Elizabeth Boleyn. This Elizabeth Boleyn was married to Sir James Boleyn, the brother of Anne's father, Thomas, Earl of Wiltshire. And whilst ostensibly having an aunt with her should have been a comfort, this was not the case here, for Elizabeth Boleyn and her niece had never gotten along, and reports suggest that Elizabeth Boleyn enjoyed watching her niece suffer as she now did. Anne was vocal about her displeasure with the selection of the women attending her, saying that she thought it very unkind of the king to put such about me as I never loved. Cromwell gave strict instructions that the women were not to engage in any way with Anne Boleyn unless Lady Kingston were present, which Kingston actually pushed back on, explaining to Cromwell that his wife slept in the same chamber as him and not in the room with the Queen, and that it would therefore be impossible to entirely police every spoken word exchanged, which Cromwell grudgingly accepted. In a great twist of irony, Anne Boleyn, who was famed for her intelligence and shrewd nature, did more to damage her position than rectify it during the first few days of her imprisonment. Understandably, she became increasingly unguarded and began to talk more freely, desperately trying to determine what it was that she had done and how the accusations could have been dreamt up. Historians are almost universally in agreement that Anne Boleyn was entirely innocent of all of the charges made against her, a sentiment that I wholeheartedly agree with, and so Anne herself must have been completely flummoxed by what was happening. In openly questioning and recounting times that she had spoken with the men accused alongside her, she only fanned the flames further. She spoke of the supposed conversation that she had had with Sir Henry Norris, in which she had remonstrated him for not marrying, famously telling him, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." She also mentioned her concerns about what Francis Weston would say of her, for according to Kingston, who penned a letter to Cromwell, Anne recounted a story in which she questioned his love for her cousin Madge Shelton. Weston responded that he loved another, to which Anne said, "Who is that?" with Weston retorting, "It is yourself, madam." Anne supposedly gave Weston a telling off for his gumption, but even so, the damage had been done, and Weston became the next of the arrestees on a one-way trip to the Tower of London, shortly followed by perhaps the most surprising of the arrestees, William Brereton, who spent practically all of his time away from the court in the north of England and had little to no contact with Anne Boleyn. His family made huge efforts to have him pardoned, including the willingness to forfeit lands and titles, but this had little impact, for William Brereton was an affirmed enemy of Cromwell, and given his prominence in the north of England, his removal was beneficial to Cromwell's plans, to say the least. 2 further arrests took place, Richard Page and Sir Thomas Wyatt. Both of these men would, however, not go to trial or lose their lives. Given their close affinity to Thomas Cromwell, it is clear just how much the latter was pulling strings to suit his own purposes. Despite Anne's relative unpopularity, her arrest was nonetheless shocking and considered as such, even by her detractors. The few friends that Anne did have can only have been horrified at what was happening to the Queen, although little could be done to help her. One of the very few who was willing to put his head above the parapet was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had a long and loyal relationship with the Boleyn family and owed much of his court advancement to Anne herself. On the 3rd of May he penned a letter to the king in which he said, I am in such perplexity that my mind is clean amazed, for I never had better opinion in woman than I had in her, which maketh me to think that she should not be culpable. Your grace knoweth that next unto your grace I was most bound unto her of all creatures living, wherefore I most humbly beseech your grace to suffer me in that, which both God's law, nature, and also her kindness blindeth me unto, that I may, with your grace's favour, wish and pray for her, that she may declare herself innocent. Another, which may come as a surprise to many who supported Anne Boleyn at this time, was her own sister-in-law, Jane Boleyn, who is consistently and erroneously viewed as a key architect in Anne's downfall. Contrary to this, Jane Boleyn wrote a letter to her husband George to comfort him with the knowledge that she would petition the king on his and Anne's behalf. Sadly, the original letter is lost, but its tone and what Jane intended was reported by Kingston directly to Thomas Cromwell. It was around this time, on the 4th of May, that Anne learned her brother was also in the Tower, accused of adultery and thus incest with her. This most shocking of accusations must have chilled Anne to the bone and made an already horrific situation all the worse. She did, however, state that her brother being close to her in space, although they were not lodged together, did serve as something of a comfort. Anne instructed Kingston to allow her to write to Thomas Cromwell, and also expressed her bewilderment at not being visited by the King's Council further since her arrival at the Tower of London a few days earlier. Throughout her time in the Tower, Anne Boleyn displayed behaviour commensurate with one undergoing immense and almost debilitating stress. William Kingston recorded that in some instances she was determined to die, and in the next hour much contrary to that. She began to make absurd claims, such as that there would be no rain until she was safely out of the Tower, and also hoped that the king would allow her to retire to a nunnery. But in the next breath she said that she knew she would be going to heaven, for she had done many good deeds in her life. Although we all love that scene from Anne of 1,000 Days in which Henry confronts Anne at the Tower and Anne gives him the mother of all dressing downs, the scene is entirely fictitious, for Henry VIII never visited Anne, nor did he personally write to her during her incarceration. There is, however, a letter which may have been written by Anne to Henry. It is lengthy, and some historians believe it to be a fake, although most recently Sandra Vasoli has made a compelling argument that the letter is genuine, and thus Anne's final letter. Although Anne begs pardon from the king, the main mission of the letter is a plea to not have the men accused alongside her suffer. Anne, if the letter is indeed genuine, states, "My only request shall be that myself may only bear the burden of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of these poor gentlemen, who, as I understand, are likewise in imprisonment for my sake." The letter was said to have been found among a series of letters owned by Cromwell that were discovered after his execution. If it is genuine, then it had no effect, for just days later the four men, Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and the poor, broken Mark Smeaton, were called to the bar, where under an act of oyer and termine were found guilty and sentenced to the full horrors of a traitor's death, to be hung, drawn and quartered, although this was mercifully commuted to a more simple beheading. Plans were already well underway for Anne Boleyn's own trial and that of her brother, who as members of the nobility would be tried before their peers. All Anne could do was now wait and see what was in store in this next colossal step towards her destruction. As such, Anne's trial will be the subject of this week's main podcast episode, coming this Thursday, in which I will discuss Anne's trial with a woman who has studied the subject extensively, historian, author, and all-round Anne Boleyn expert, Claire Ridgway. And so that brings me to the end of this week's subscriber episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. May is always such a significant month in history for Tudor historians as we continue to look back on what happened and why it happened to one of history's most remarkable women. Join me, as I said, on Thursday for the next chapter of The Downfall of Anne Boleyn. Thank you again for your support of the Tudor Chest, and speak soon.